So welcome everyone to Harrison Public Library event, author Mary Beth Keane in conversation with Karen Dukess. And now I would like our programming librarian, Giovanna Inassi, who is the mastermind behind all of our wonderful program, to introduce our authors. And Giovanna, please.
Yes. Welcome everybody today. I also wanted to mention that we do have the Village Bookstore owner with us today, Jennifer Cohn. And
Hi, how are you?
She does have signed copies of both Mary Beth Keane's book and Karen Dukess's book. Did you want to say anything, Jen?
Yeah, I'll just say hi. Some of you, I see some Pleasantville people coming in, so we may have met in the store, or during normal times. I'm often at the events with Giovanna and Galina and Harrison, and they do great in-person events and just effortlessly move this whole operation online and without missing a beat. So it's really exciting to still do these events and still get to meet great authors with like Karen and Mary Beth. I put in the chat, just so you guys have it for your record, our website, if it's easier for you to do that, how to call us, and how to get books. So if after this you'd like your own personal copy, we'll have book plates, and I think Mary Beth will also be sending us book plates or signing books. So we're happy to get those to you for now and for holiday gifts too. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen. And I have the pleasure of introducing our authors today. I will start with Karen Dukess, who has worked as, has a work history as eclectic as her taste in books. She has been a tour guide in the former Soviet Union, a newspaper reporter in Florida, a magazine publisher in Russia for nearly a decade, a speech writer on gender equality for the United Nations Development Program. She has blogged on raising boys for the Huffington Post and written book reviews for USA Today. She has a degree in Russian studies from Brown University and a master's in journalism from Columbia University. She lives with her family near New York City and spends as much time as possible in Truro on Cape Cod. Mary Beth Keane attended Barnard College and the University of Virginia, where she received an MFA. She was awarded a John S. Guggenheim Fellowship for fiction writing and has received citations from the National Book Foundation, PEN America, and the Hemingway Society. She is the author of The Walking People, Fever, and most recently, Ask Again, Yes, which was an instant New York Times bestseller. To date, translation rights to Ask Again, Yes have sold in 21 languages, with most translated editions forthcoming in 2020, 2021. Both Fever and Ask Again, Yes are in development to become limited television series. Please welcome Mary Beth Keane and Karen Dukess.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to do this. I guess I get to start. I think somebody's not muted, or is there some feedback or something? Well, okay.
I've forbidden anybody in my family to come in, so I don't think it's me.
I don't think it's you. Okay. So I'm thrilled to be doing this. I read this book last fall, couldn't put it down, and I just read it again, which is amazing because I haven't been reading that much the past few weeks. I've been so distracted, but I picked up Ask Again, Yes again and got right into it. And I have so many questions, but I know a lot of people on this have read the book. I know that Harrison was doing this as a community read, but Mary Beth, can you start out? I'd like to hear it in your words, just sort of give like a quick overview of what it's about for people who haven't read it. And I think that we can talk about content enough in a way that doesn't spoil anything for people who haven't read it, but because there are a lot of themes here, but I'd love for you to just give your summary of what this book is about.
What is this book about? Well, first, I want to thank you, Karen, for doing this. I'm in your seat a lot. I know that it's quite a bit of work. I don't know if people realize that. I met Karen at the Miami Book Fair, right? That's where we met.
Yes.
And we got to chatting, as you do, because a lot of authors get, thrown together. There's all sorts of cocktail parties, even though we're all misanthropes and we don't know what we're doing there. And I don't know. I just liked you right away, went home, read your book, and I want to give a plug for Karen's book, which is called The Last Book Party, even though she told me not to do this. but it's a wonderful book. You know, it's different from mine, but it's character driven. You know, but it's a literary novel, and I think if you liked mine, you'd probably like Karen's too. Anyway, so Ask Again, Yes, the summary. This should be easier by now, I suppose, but it's about two families who end up sort of by happenstance living next door to one another in a suburb of New York City called Gillum. The dads in both houses are police officers with the NYPD, and they're rookies. And they sort of hear about this town as being kind of a cop town at work. That families are not close except for what, you know, they do for a living sort of bonds them. The son in one house, the only child, and the youngest daughter in the other house become quite close. And the book is really about their friendship and love and the relationship between the families over a long period of time. There's an event that happens that you think will drive the families apart, you know, that they will never see each other again, or rather they think that. The reader knows that likely they will, and that's what the story is about, and it is. But it's really about forgiveness. So like summing up a literary novel with plot is always difficult, I think. Maybe you've seen the same, Karen, I don't know. But
oh yeah, definitely. I'm still not good at it. So I know, Mary Beth, that because you and I have like talked about how we write, and I know you write your way into a story. I think a lot of people who, especially people who don't write, think that, you know, writers sit down, think it all up, the plot, the key points, and then they write it. And I guess some writers do, but Mary Beth and I are not among those writers. So we can talk about that later in terms of when you kind of figured out what it's about. But I'm curious, I'm always curious about like, what was the very beginning germ of the idea? You know, was it an image? Was it Peter and Kate, who are the young people that, you know, fall in love in these families? What was the very, very beginning of this?
The beginning for me of this book was Peter. Frances and Peter sort of arrived in my imagination together, but I think Peter as a child who was lonely, but smart, you know, and self-sufficient, you know, he was a certain type of kid that I just saw sort of wholesale right away. But I also saw Frances early on as a young rookie cop who had absolutely no idea what he signed himself up for. I didn't know what those two things, I mean, this was the struggle of the book, what these two people had to do with one another for a really long time. I knew that Peter was not Frances's child. At one point, I even thought I was writing two books maybe, but I don't know, I just kept at it. But those were, I always start with a person, sort of a personality, maybe a quirk of a personality, and then I put them in action and see what they do. Things that might surprise them or surprise me, and then you learn more about them, and that's sort of how I begin.
That's fascinating, because reading the book this second time, I think I felt this the first time. I feel like Peter's really the heart of the story. I mean, those early chapters, you know, he's in his home kind of raising himself because his mother is ill. He doesn't even have the words to say what's wrong with her, mental illness. And his father is kind of, you know, absent emotionally. And those scenes are so heartbreaking of Peter as a child doing very adult things, you know, getting himself to school. And there's one day when he tells his mom he had 2 jelly sandwiches, you know, one for breakfast, one for lunch, like trying to get through to her. One of the things that was so interesting to me, that's such a theme in this novel, is the not talking about things, you know, not talking about really big things. And I think there's a character in it who casts it as an Irish thing, you know, to sort of not talk about the difficult things. And even when, you know, we as a reader can see so clearly that Peter's mother is mentally ill, all that he's told as a child is she's sensitive, women have a hard time, she's on her feet all day. And it's interesting to me that this sense of not talking about it, and also the sort of female aspect of it, that it gets sort of explained away. I wonder if you could talk about, I guess those are really two different things.
Well, they are sort of the same thing too. I mean, I guess this is cultural, but like female issues and all the things that contains is something that is, secretive and private and not discussed, in a larger family setting, plus the mental illness. I don't think that Brian Stanhope or really anyone who was around Anne thought to themselves explicitly, she's mentally ill, and then sort of put it aside. I think that people, tell themselves things all the time in order to protect themselves and their lives and their own, I think so many people go about their day just trying to get through the day. And I think if you add in the idea that there's something seriously wrong with my, my spouse or my friend or my mother, that would have just put them over the top. But I don't mean to malign the whole Irish community. I don't know if it's an Irish trait or not. I only know my own, my own people, I guess. And so I write what I know, but and I think this is part of what draws me to the subjects I'm drawn to, is that I'm not that interested in people or in writing people, I suppose, who are really articulate about their own emotions. I went through college, I've worked in publishing, I've read a lot of books, and I really appreciate and am big fans of certain books where people are really fluent in their own emotions. And I think that's really admirable. In real life, I don't know a lot of those people. The people I grew up with, you just went to work and you came home and you could potentially live in misery for 30 years, but it's yours. And you just sort of soldier on. And those are the people that are more interesting to me. The ones who say, I feel like sometimes when I teach fiction, I say the things we say and the things we think and the things we feel are actually three different things. Sometimes people make them two things. You could think something secretly and say something, but I think we're also hidden from ourselves, which is a whole other aspect. And so those are the people I'm interested in. And the fact that they're Irish is probably maybe a fear on my part of writing too far into another culture. I mean, I'm writing such a close third person that I have to almost become that person. And to do that, you have to feel comfortable, like adopting them, becoming them. And which is not to say I'm against anyone doing that. I'm all for it. I'm just more of a coward, I think, than other people are. And I'm afraid of getting it wrong. But I get that question a lot, and I want to apologize to all Irish people who are more open with their emotions. These are just the ones I know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I mentioned that in the book, because these people are from Ireland, either a long way back, one says, or more recently. But I think part of the reason people relate to the book so much is because the silence, not talking about things that are clearly affecting people's lives, is something that's so cross-cultural that I think people can relate to in so many ways. And I love but Kate, the young woman, her character is very different in that way. And there's a moment when she's parsing over this violent act that has happened, and she's really just kind of figuring out how it happened, and everyone is sort of stunned that she's bringing it up, and she's like, why can't we talk about it? Yeah. And it was such a kind of it was just such a wonderful moment, because she's not like that. Like, she's grown up in this culture, but she's fierce, and she's just kind of is very direct about things.
She's blunt too.
Yeah, she's blunt and just kind of wants to see things as they are. Although even her, when you're talking about how you can have things going on in your own life and not see it, when she's older and she's married and her husband is drinking too much, that it takes her a long time to see what was right in front of her as well. And you articulated that really well, how suddenly it was like a math problem she couldn't solve, and all of a sudden she saw it clearly.
Yeah, I think that's kind of but for Kate, I think that's because it's the way he was behaving was just something that she would not do. I think it's hard. It's sort of like, if you are a person who doesn't lie, I think you're more surprised when you're lied to.
Yeah.
It doesn't, I wouldn't do those things. And the fact that you've done, it takes you a minute. If you're a person who lies, you can sort of spot, it sort of takes one to know one a little bit. And I think she's different from, say, Peter's father, in that it's not that she knew and sort of tried to squash it. I think she was really slow on the uptake. Her father drank, she knew lots of drinkers. It wasn't a problem. And this was another thing that interested me in writing this book. I think I'm used to reading and seeing in movies and on shows, the fall down drunk.
Right.
Who can't hold a job and the whole family has to get, but this kind of in between where you certainly have a problem with alcohol, but you can go to, you're getting dressed, you can look presentable, you can get to work, you can be, that has not been, I think, explored as much, at least in what I'm reading and seeing. And so it would take a minute, for her to sort of face what she has to face.
Right. And there's also that moment where she's doing an autopsy at her job and they're talking about the person had been an alcoholic. They drank so much beer. She was like, but he only drank beer. Like, he's not alcoholic, that.
No, it's funny, that came from a workshop. The very first time my work was workshopped at UVA. I've told my UVA friends this. I did an MFA at the University of Virginia, and I got there, and I think it was my first story, and there was a character who would drink like a 6-pack every night. The story was about something completely different. This was just a detail. And the workshop, all they wanted to talk about was his alcoholism. And I was like, what are these people talking about? I'm like, he's just drinking a 6-pack every night. And it was so discussed. I was really shaken. I'm like, I don't think I know where the bar is at or where it should be. The fact that was even a topic kind of rattled me a lot. And then I realized that probably my perspective is different than other people's.
That's interesting. When you were talking about like writing this book in such close third person, I thought it was so interesting that that you really get into everybody's heads and not in a way that's sort of like some novels where it's like, A, B, C, D, we're in this person's head and then it repeats, that you really, it's very fluid. And it gets a really close insight into everybody. And I think it'd be because of the plot and the Peter and Kate story going through this. And you could say that Ask Again, Yes is really their story in a way. But in reading it the second time, I saw how much it's really about everybody. It's really about these two families, except for Peter's father. You don't really go into his perspective, except for like a couple of lines, I think.
Yeah.
Did you consider doing that? I mean, he also seems to be, we can talk about forgiveness, which I think, as you say, this story is really about. But so yeah, I'm just curious why you didn't give us, because he doesn't take responsibility at all. He's not an interesting person in that way.
Well, I actually don't get into Lena too much either, for sort of the same reason as Lena is Francis's wife, because they're both, well, none of this is conscious while I'm writing, but every time I wrote either Brian or Lena, it felt a little bit flat. And I think it's because they were so, in a way, simple. Lena is just good. She's just a good person. She's not going to do the wrong. There's no real moral complication in there. For a minute, how she deals with something that happens to her in the book. I do enter her point of view here and there.
Yeah.
Brian was sort of the same. I mean, he does the wrong thing. I don't think he's a bad guy. I think I'm one of the few people who actually likes him, or at least has sympathy for him. I think if he had married a different person and he had a different family, he would have been sort of the guy. He would have been throwing block parties and organizing, who's going to bring what sides. And he would have been, a fun-loving, popular guy that everyone liked to know. But instead, at age 21, he was handed something that was much bigger than he could handle. And so his whole life was defined by that. And so in the moments when his wife, Peter's mother, goes upstairs and she shuts the door, does he know it's weird for a person to go into their room for 4 days and not come out? Yes. But in the meantime, he can have a beer and watch a basketball game and not be interrupted. And he just takes it, and I found it, well, it was already like a 400-page book for a start. So adding another point of view would have just been impractical, but I felt like I could get at him from the outside more than I could from the others. He made a selfish move, and that's really all, that was important that people know, I think. I mean, I could write a whole other book probably from his point of view, and it would feel totally different than this one. And I think he's earned it to some extent, but it was a variety of things that just made me not want to get there with him.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I found that I didn't feel the lack of that is what we did get from him was a sense that some terrible things that happened, he was very defensive about. Like, it wasn't really his fault, so he was kind of a victim. And no one else really had that kind of attitude. And I think it's not an intriguing attitude to go into someone on that, you know, unless you're going to kind of get beyond it.
Well, I think also he came from where he came from. You know, I think this was also part of the genesis of the book. When I started writing about Peter, the first draft of the book began with, it was from Kate's point of view in the first person, but they were adults. And I couldn't really show why you should be, say, worried for Kate and Anne to be in the same room together, you know, without all of this flashback. And then I kept going back, and, you know, everyone comes from somewhere. You know, you're a product of how you were raised or what you saw or encountered as a child. And so with Kate and Peter, I realized I had to go back. With, you know, Brian, I could have gone back too, but then I've got how many like generations of different families going back. Frances or Anne, there's something that sort of emerges about Anne toward the end of the book and her childhood and her mother back in Ireland. And you could go back again, you know, and have another whole sad book about that. But, you know, the point is that like, we don't just erupt fully formed as 30-year-olds, you know, we're all just trying to reconcile ourselves with the way we've been raised. So
when did you realize that this book, that what you were writing about was forgiveness as one of the really big things about this book?
Probably at least 2 drafts in. I was like circling.
That's so encouraging.
What? I know, it's horrible.
I love hearing that.
Is it encouraging or is it really depressing? It sometimes feels the same to me. Yeah, it took a long time. I mean, you know, I think people who don't write think, or I shouldn't say what they think, but my impression is that they think you have a story and you're writing toward a conclusion, but there's always one thing, you know, the glue that holds it together. And for, I think 2 drafts, I thought it was love, you know, like love for a parent to a child. But it really wasn't, you know, the love was there. It really never was in question. You know, Anne loves Peter. Some people just can't show it the way other people can. And when I realized it's about forgiveness, sort of everything, you know, it's like looking at the same view from a different window, you know, and then it just sort of clarified a lot of things for me. And then in the next draft, it got sharper, you know, and then the next draft, and then the next draft.
And somebody's saying in the comments that she thought the glue was redemption.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're part and parcel of the same thing. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting at the end, and I'm probably I often in these interviews, I talk more about like the author and her background and her favorite books and reading and process, but I just finished the book again, so I'm so immersed in it. But I thought it was really interesting at the end when you're talking about forgiveness, it's sort of tied to gratitude and appreciation, you know, this sense of we're okay, you know, these some really, really traumatic things happened, but we're doing okay. And that somehow makes it easier to forgive, which made me think like, well, what if all those horrible things had happened and it hadn't come out okay? You know, then the forgiveness becomes a much higher bar. But it was interesting that it was tied to that. Maybe it has to be, you know.
Well, and I think forgiveness means different things to different people. Forgiveness to me is just sort of some sort of like peace with the way things went. It doesn't mean necessarily inviting that person back into your life if he or she was a toxic element. You know, I think it's just a way of finding peace with the way you are and the way things have turned out. But I think that sort of came directly from reaching a certain age and friends and, you know, extended networks of people from college and grad school and all sorts of places, like really fixating on the way things were for them a long time ago, you know, or the way their mothers or fathers were. I feel like the minute I had a baby, almost the moment I had a baby and realized I'm still myself, like I still have no clue what I'm doing. You sort of forgive your parents for everything, I think, or at least not in every case, of course, but you know, so your mother blew out your birthday candles when you turned 13 because she was impatient, you know, like get over it.
You're probably really tired.
Certain things you cannot get over and shouldn't, you know, until they're aired out. But certain things that I've noticed some people hold on to, it's just such a weight, you know, that you could just let go of. And I think, you know, there was some big stuff in this book, but really when you look around, I mean, especially now, not to sound corny, and I'm not really a religious person at all, but we've all had a really hard 9 months, and some of the kids whine and everybody's whining, but like, here we are, and some people aren't. So
Yeah.
and I use harsher language at home, but basically get your act together,
Yeah.
go take a walk, you'll feel better in 20
Yeah.
minutes.
I thought in the book, I mean, so Kate really decides to kind of let her mother-in-law back into their lives, not just because she thinks it will help her husband. But the mother-in-law, is, for anyone who hasn't read the book, has done something really horrible to Kate's family, and it's really when she's thinking about what if it were her own child, so she's experiencing that same thing that you're talking about, that becoming a parent has made her look at the whole thing differently, and that's when she decides to let Anne in,
And I think
thinking as a mother.
Kate's family is like my family. They're so clannish. My mother, to this day, if she'll put $100 in a Christmas card, she'll tell us, and all her daughters, she'll tell us not to tell our husbands. Like she'd be like, "This is for you. There's no reason there's no reason your husband needs to know about this. Go to Sephora or whatever." And we're like, "Ma, we can go to Sephora on our own," but it's the same except times a million. She'll say if there's ever like an argument, all of us are like this, like, you always have a place to stay here. Like, you're not really blood until you're blood. You know what I mean? It's a terrible thing to say, but I think that's how Kate's family is. And Kate needed to reach out to someone who truly loved Peter as much as she did. And her dad and mom were not going to be that. They've accepted him. They do love him. He's the father of their grandchildren, but she's their girl, and so they're just always going to side with her. And I think instinctively she knew that she needed someone who would side with Peter above all to help her through this moment with him.
I love the town that you created. I assume it's based on the town that Gilham is based on the town you grew up in.
I should have just named it Pearl River, but
why did you call it Gilham? How'd you come up with Gilham?
I can't remember. Gilham probably means something. I'm trying to remember something to do with peace, maybe. I don't know. I sometimes I just put my finger on a map, and if it sounds vaguely like I can pronounce it and not too, maybe wedded to a particular place, I'll use it. I honestly don't know how I landed on Gilham, but if I named it Pearl River, which it is largely based on, then I would get 100 emails about there was no gazebo in Pearl River in 1987, but you had them walking by the gazebo, and I'd be like, "Thank you for getting in touch."
Right.
And I'd have to like.
I love the time period that I don't know what Pearl River is like today, but the sense of like that the kids played stickball in the street because their dads taught them to play stickball, and they grew up, in the city. So the fact that they all had these half-acre plots didn't matter. They were still going to play in the street. And the freedom that the kids had to play sort of until dinner, it's very different, I think, than most suburban towns today. It was like a nice, nostalgic look back at that kind of
childhood. Still like that, honestly. My kids leave their bikes out for a week, at a time.
Nice.
They're gone. When friends, say from college or from other parts of the country, come to Pearl River to visit, they wonder why everyone has such a strong Queens accent. I'm like, that's because everybody's mother was from Queens, and so they can't. But we're all inheriting where we're from the previous generation.
So obviously the two men in this book and the two families are cops. And, I thought it was really interesting the way Francis in particular becomes a cop. It's like not a really thought out. I mean, especially when you think about it in the context of today and the police and, all the politics around that. It's very much like two guys come into the bar in the pub where he's working. It's like, that looks like a nice job. They look kind of like cool guys in their suits, their uniforms or whatever. Maybe I could do that. And suddenly it becomes his whole world. I'm just wondering if everything that has gone on in the past year with the police and Black Lives Matter and just all the incidents made you look at this in a different way, or if you would still be writing it in the same way. I mean, I love the fact that, there's some mention of that side of being a cop in this book, but this is really about these men as people and their home lives and their communities, and their job is just their job. It's not about that. I just wonder if it affected how you thought about it this year. Like if this book had come out in June of this year.
Yeah, I probably would have gotten much different questions.
Yeah.
about it. I mean, I did, like you said, this is a portrait of police officers off duty,
Yeah.
but I think like parents and children, when they're on the job, they still are who they are. They come from where they come from, and you take all of those preconceptions and prejudices and assumptions and you bring them to work and you apply them whether you know it or not. I mean, I tried to indicate, especially there's a moment in the book where Frances sort of covers for Brian because of an incident that happens at the supermarket. And I don't know if those of you who've read it may remember, and they don't want him to get, jammed up in this situation that's not really exactly his fault, but he could have been less sloppy. And so they just go about and deal with it. They close ranks and deal with it on their own. I mean, that's a very sort of light, I guess, nod toward the way things work. But in the book, I tried to indicate that like who matters, who you are matters to outcomes. And when there's an incident with Peter, when he's in crisis toward the end of the book, that could have gone, and in one draft actually did go much worse. It sort of distracted from the point of my story. And so I revised it so that nobody got hurt when Peter sort of has an accident at work. But yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, I can't quite speak as well to the current generation. I know fewer police officers, my age or younger, certainly, than I did in that previous generation, like my dad's age, or maybe slightly younger than him. But as far as I can tell, the way that Frances becomes a cop is the same for a lot of people. It's a real, at least for the cops I knew, it's a class issue. You get a certain type of job, or you could be a cop, which comes with a beautiful, well-pressed uniform. It comes with respect and a pension. I don't think a wealthy person ever becomes a cop, at least in that generation. I think that it was entirely a decision that was considered sort of smart and long-term. And if you weren't of a family that could, say, go to graduate school for 4 years and then become something else, it was a really solid choice. And I don't think a lot of 21-year-olds understand the, social and political implications of a decision that they're making for 5 months from now. I think they're like, well, I could buy a little cape in the suburbs and have a kid, and you have a vision for yourself. And I don't think you're thinking of anyone else. And I don't know that that's necessarily wrong. I think it's a lot to ask to take in everything. Which is not to say there's not a serious problem within the police department.
Yeah, it's also really interesting that you set up in the beginning, you start out reading a novel that starts out with these two cops on the job, and their attraction to a town like Gilham is a sense like, oh, I could go there and leave all this work stuff at home. They didn't want to talk about it at home. They wanted to leave the stress and the violence back on the job in the city. But yet here, the most violent thing to happen in Frances's life happens almost in his own house, next door to his own house,
in another cop's house.
Yeah. The sense that, I mean, that just kind of echoes what you're saying. Like, you don't go into it planning it all out, the ramifications, and you have no clue what the ramifications are going to be anyway.
Right. And I don't think individuals, I don't think it's a fiction writer's job to answer questions, or suggest solutions, but rather just to point things out. And I don't think individuals are thinking about systems, in the large sense, and how they're either rigged or how they're wrong. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. We should probably all be thinking of that more. But if you're writing realistic fiction and you have people thinking in those large global ways, it just doesn't ring true. I don't think that's the way people are, for better or for worse. And so that's the way these guys are.
Yeah. So did you know, I know you don't come from a police family, but did you have a certain knowledge and comfort of sort of police culture? Or was that all a research thing?
Yeah, no, there was a little bit of a mix, I guess. I had no family who were on the police force. At least my parents are Irish immigrants. And so they were all honestly laborers or bartenders, or eventually owned bars. My next novel is actually set in a bar, and I feel totally at home with all of that. But I had a lot of friends growing up whose dads were NYPD, and I think I just became fascinated with it really young, because I would see this man, they were almost always men. I don't think there were any moms who were cops when I was growing up in my circle, but they would be these like jolly guys flipping burgers, skimming their pools, constantly joking around with the kids, coaching soccer. And then you might glimpse like a gun strapped to a calf or to a hip. And then I'd ask questions. And then I would think, maybe a couple years later, like, what must Mr. So-and-so see at work? And why does he have to have his off-duty weapon on him? And in those days, you had to have it on you at all times. And so I think I just started thinking about like, how a personality could be split, how you can seem one way, but actually probably have to be another way. And that just, I don't know, it's a job that's always been interesting to me, to sort of be able to wield a certain type of power if you're not comfortable with it, or if you don't feel confident in it, and how, this sort of relates to your last question, like how you demonstrate that power for better or for worse, and so it took a sort of a mixture of my own memory and impressions. And then I did talk to a lot of police officers. We'd go to a diner in some cases and just shoot the shit for a couple of hours and drink a lot of coffee. And if there's anything I know about cops, it's that they love to tell stories about the job, and will go on and on and on. But the funny thing is, I wasn't ever interested in the stories. I was more interested in how they felt, while things were happening. But yeah, and I had access to a lot of people, which was good.
Yeah. Somebody's talking about your sensitivity and compassion in describing addiction and mental illness, and whether you did research on that. And I was wondering that too, because you're, when you go into Anne's perspective and her description of the way she feels an incident coming on, it was really vivid, her sense of certain physical sensations and a fogginess that she saw, and then she would sense something building in her. And not only did you describe it really well, but you also then later on described her starting to feel it and manage it. It was really fascinating. It was like we got to see the progression of her when it was really bad, and how she had learned to live with mental illness. Like, it wasn't like she was all better, but with, medication and treatment, she was learning to sort of recognize the signs.
Yeah. And she was, in a really twisted way, she was lucky to have had all of those years of hospitalization and forced therapy. And then she was equipped, to go out into the world and sort of deal with what she had to deal with. But I mean, I did research a lot. I had some personal experience in my life with both addiction and mental illness and the people I love. But, and, it's how we treat people who are mentally ill in this country has come a long way, in the last 50 years, but it still has a ways to go. I mean, right now, if you have a person in your life who thinks he is going to be an astronaut and he's going to be doing this, that, and the other, and he's actually homeless in Albuquerque, there's nothing that you can do for that person if he's or she is a certain age. There's no, unless they commit a crime. And I know that those limitations and protections are there for us, especially as women, from a time when husbands would tuck their wives away in a mental hospital for a year if they were getting on their nerves. But at the same time, like it's the most frustrating thing to have a loved one in your life who is self-harming or is, just on a trajectory that is not going well, and you cannot make them take medicine. You cannot put them in a hospital against their will for the most part, and different states have different laws, of course, but.
I mean, that's, that makes me think of that, sort of very violent incident in the book, and how there's a gun and Brian leaves the gun and walks away, almost like the only way he can think out of the situation is to put his wife in a situation where she'll end it. Obviously what happens is not what he wanted to happen, but it does speak to this sort of hopelessness of it. Like, you can't talk about it, you can't force it. He was trapped in it. I mean,
and he's still in a culture where, it sounds insane, where you can't really leave, it's without something big happening. It sounds crazy. When I was 25 and I would hear about these horrible marriages, I would think, like, why don't they just get divorced? It turns out it is really complicated, especially when there's a kid and there are two families and there's And so, which is not to say it's right, but he is just doing what the only thing he can think of, which is leave the room.
Yeah.
But I was really nervous about that aspect of the book. I didn't get into Anne's point of view for almost a whole draft. It wasn't until second draft that I realized I had to try, or else she would feel too much like a villain. And I didn't want her to. And the only way to know that she's not a villain is to get inside her and see that she may appear scary and aggressive and she's shouting and she just seems mean. But inside, you know, after reading a lot of memoirs, it became clear that this common denominator was fear. You know, if you're afraid, then suddenly it tips over into other, you know, ways of acting out. But I think if the world knew that this person's actually afraid, you know, I don't know. When I hear someone's afraid, I just feel sympathy, even
Right.
if I'm not afraid of that thing. And so I hoped kind of that's how it would work with the reader and with Anne.
Yeah,
But
I mean, that's seen in when she's in the supermarket and it starts so benignly, you know, she's waiting for her number to be called and she kind of misses it and then it just escalates from there. I thought it was very well done because you can see exactly how the bystanders would take it, you know, and but yet we've kind of been through her journey. How did you, I mean, I guess I don't know, you probably can't answer this question, and again, this is a writerly question I'm asking because I want to know how to do this, but I just thought it was so interesting your choices of when to go into someone's perspective and when not to. And so that we got a little of Anne but not too much, we got a tiny bit of Brian. Like I mean, you talked about, you know, why you didn't go into Brian's perspective much and Lena's, but everybody else, it wasn't, I feel like it's more often a kind of formulaic thing. Like this book is going to alternate between four perspectives and yours is not like that. It's more of like each situation suggests who we need to hear from in a way. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, any kind of response would imply I know what I'm doing and I don't, you know, like I think I set out to write the kind of book you're referring to, like this is Anne's chapter, but it just, I find, well, first of all, I think I overwrite and I then cut. So any scene, anytime you think I chose not to write in a point of view, I probably did write in that point of view. I just cut it later. And I think I'm a big, I love cutting. Like it feels, I could just feel it becoming sharper and better. Sentence level, even I find I use two adjectives sometimes or two phrases that ultimately mean the same thing. And I feel like physical relief when I start cutting them out and it just keeps getting leaner. But I don't bother worrying about that for at least a draft, you know, and I don't draft the whole thing, usually about a half or 2/3, and then you kind of realize it's garbage and then you go back and you try again. But with this, it was really overwritten, and then I would just cut back what I didn't need, you know, whatever didn't further the story, I would leave. In terms of when to know to switch point of view, I really like listen to I don't think I'm a very intellectual writer. I don't know if that makes sense. I think I just listen to my gut and my body. Like if I feel bored writing, I assume you're bored reading it, you know? And so as soon as I think like, well, here I am over in Kate's point of view, I wonder what Anne is up to, then why not?
You switch,
go
yeah.
over- Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I had a writing class, I think it was with Matthew Thomas, who wrote We Are Not Ourselves, beautiful book. And he said, it was such a revelation to me when he said, if there's a scene that you just don't want to write, like it just feels like heavy and boring to you, but you feel like it needs to be there. He's like, then just skip it. It probably doesn't need to be there. Like if you're
Right.
bored writing it, your reader's not going to want to read it either. You could just jump ahead and then refer back to what the reader needs to know or whatever. And that was such a revelation to me because I get in this sense of like, you have to, if you're getting to a place, you have to say everything that happened on the way to that place.
Right.
And,
No, we don't need to have all the stage directions.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that could be cut later. I
yeah.
sort of feel similar, in a similar vein, I guess. Sometimes I get this feeling like there's a scene I want to write, like, or a particular place I want a character to be, or a situation I want them to be in that doesn't make sense for what I'm writing today or the plan I have for the book. And I've learned enough to know that I should just go ahead and write it.
Write it, yeah.
And it'll change the book maybe, but it's almost always for the best. And I'll worry about where it fits into the puzzle later. But sometimes a book, you know, needs a break when it's like, sort of relentlessly linear, for example, and then suddenly you think, you know what, I want to see this weird thing she did at age 12, go write that scene at 12. And then it becomes a lot, if you can follow the energy, I say follow it wherever it leads you, and then worry about it being a mess later on. I had someone tell me recently that she couldn't understand why her book didn't sell because it was a perfectly competent novel. And I thought that was such a weird, don't you agree it's such a weird thing to say? She's like, basically it progresses from A to B to C. There's a conclusion. Like I followed an arc. I'm like, but where's the soul of this book? It's like, it just depressed me for weeks.
You have to have a lot of faith to write the way you write, right? Because you just have to believe that all these things you're doing, not being sure why you're doing them, that you're gonna figure it out in the end. That it's for a reason. That every path you take, even if you get completely in the wrong path and have to regroup and come back, that somehow it's gonna end up okay. Maybe after 3 books you believe that, or I don't know. Is every book just as overwhelming?
As messy and problematic as the last I'm seeing.
Right.
I mean, I'm in that moment now where I'm writing a book and it's just not that good yet, or some days it seems good, some days it doesn't. It's a mess. There's some parts that just don't go, and you do forget, it's like having a baby. You're like, oh wait, this is terrible. And then you remember all over again, and you just hope I got through it last time, I'll get through it this time. So, but I can't outline. I've tried it. I have so much admiration for people who have an outline. They have like little charts and stuff with
I'm so inspired to that.
Yeah, me too.
In fact, I put up a bulletin board when I was starting my second novel, because I'm like, I'm going to have little Post-its up and all things that are relevant to the novel. And I have one card that has a picture of mushrooms on it, because there's a mushroom thing in my novel, which is set in Russia. And that's all that's on my bulletin board, because nothing else has, I don't have like the little cards with the lines attached and all that. But
I kept a poem by Mark Strand taped above my like little writing spot, and I would read that poem almost every day, and that was my my writing map, I guess.
Somebody's asking about the title. Why is it titled Ask Again Yes?
I get this question a lot. Had I known this book would be successful, I might have rethought the title, because I honestly never thought I'd be answering any questions about it. The title comes from Joyce. It's from the Molly Bloom section of Ulysses. You don't need to be a Joyce scholar. And so I sort of put it in Kate's mouth at the end for those people who might not get that reference. There's no comma in the original. I added the comma, or rather Scribner Books added the comma. But I think there were certain things, sort of like that poem by Mark Strand. There were certain things that I went to a lot when I was having trouble writing. Sometimes they're new books, I'll just put aside my own writing and read something that I hope blows me away, inspires me or something. But then sometimes I wanted to read something that I knew I loved already. And one of those things was some sections of that Molly Bloom soliloquy at the end of Ulysses, where I think a book that is mostly cynical and sort of petty and nasty turns on its head. And you realize these two know each other a lot longer than this one day. And their history is much bigger than what we can comprehend. And so she goes back to their beginning. I don't know, to me, the book becomes larger, and the cynicism drops a little bit, and it's mixed up with sensuality and all of that stuff. And it just, to me, it's a powerful, it's the most powerful moment in that big, gigantic, intimidating novel. And so
why do you say that you would have named it something different if you had known how successful it was going to be?
Well, a lot of people can't remember. I mean, my close friend calls it like, say it again, Sam. She's like, when's that coming out? Or whatever, and I get a lot of emails that's like, I loved your book, ask me again. Or and I'm like, okay, well, it's a hard one. I mean, I love the title. I did not think I'd be, like I said, I thought I'd be fielding exactly 0 questions about it, which is another thing for those of you out there. And there always seem to be people at events who are interested in writing. Like, don't write toward any market that you imagine. is going to be out there for you when you're ready. Just write the thing you want to write, because I wrote this thing like for myself, because I couldn't predict, my last book, Fever, was supposed to be this big hit, and it really wasn't. It did
No,
fine.
now it's about a plague and people are reading it again, right?
Now she's really having a moment, Typhoid Mary. Too bad this couldn't have happened in 2013. No, I'm just kidding. That's a joke. We didn't want it to happen ever. But, I just thought, this is the book I have to write. I really don't care, if anyone reads it. This is entirely for me to work out something.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how I feel about something that's happening in my own life, and then
I also tell people, like, it's too hard and too confusing and too long a process to write a novel, to write something that isn't what you really want to write, I think.
I totally agree.
Somebody asked, when you were talking about cutting, how you overwrite and then you cut back and you love cutting. Somebody asked, does your editor then suggest more cutting?
She will, no doubt. This time, up until now, with 3 books, I've been entirely done before I submit it to a publisher. And so,
do you show it to your agent or anyone else before it's entirely done?
my agent will read it when it's done.
Done, not before.
Last time he did read a draft that he felt wasn't ready, and I brought, I sort of went back and reworked it. But I have reader friends who are writers or novelists.
Right.
Karen, I might tap you next round.
Happy to do it.
It's like dangerous to become my friend. I'm like, hey, can you read this 400 pages this weekend? Thank you. Friends from UVA, honestly. So I don't know how I feel about MFA programs. I really don't think they're necessary. I think you can waitress and do whatever and become a wonderful novelist. For me, I had no money. And so this program, tuition was paid and you get a fellowship. And I thought, like, why not go down to Charlottesville and write for 2 years? And I made some close friends in that program, and we still exchange work. And our whole relationship was built on giving each other, criticism, negative criticism for the most part. And so, but in a sense that we're trying to encourage each other, like, I know if one of them comes back to me and says, like, this is not working, they are rooting for me. They just think I need to go a different direction. And so I really trust them. And they know what I'm after, and I know what they're after. And I have to say, even if I had a big assignment and one of them said, can you read this novel for me this weekend, or 100 pages or something, I would do it. I think, we have a nice little thing going. And so I usually get feedback from that crew first, and then I sort of test the waters, maybe with someone new, but it should be someone who is used to reading things in draft, I think. Too many people tell me, my wife read it, or my best friend, they have no reason to tell you the truth.
Right.
I mean, ask my husband. He's like, this is a lose-lose.
Yeah. I love talking about I don't talk about what I'm writing very much with my husband, but I do like doing it occasionally, because I don't let him read anything. So it totally leaves him safe. Like, he can suggest something really stupid and I don't have to think he's stupid, because he hasn't read anything. So he doesn't really know what I'm talking about. But every now and then he actually suggests something good. And so that's like a win-win. But he doesn't read anything. I mean, he didn't read my novel until I had sold it.
Funny, like, if my husband gives me positive feedback, I think he's phoning it in. And he wants to have a pleasant evening. And then if he gives you negative feedback, I'm like, what do you imagine about writing fiction? Get the hell out of here, and he's like, I don't know what to do. So
it's almost like asking your husband if a dress makes you look fatter than the other dress. He has to learn to just say, like, no, not going there. Yeah. Someone said, you said you find the novel while you write it. Your novel Fever is historical fiction and therefore is fixed. These are opposite sides of the spectrum. What caused this transition? I'm not sure you'd agree with the
No,
question.
I wouldn't. I mean, Fever, I knew very little. No one really knows very much about Mary Mallon. There were a few newspaper articles about her, but most of what was written was about her case. And they were written by, like, lawyers and doctors, sort of from a distance. So her personality and the things that happened to her when she was not in government custody I just made up completely. Also, I think for me, the challenge of a book is is structure, and point of view. And those things you always have to sort of find. I mean, a book could be written in a limited third person, omniscient third person, first person. You could set it over the course of a week, which is actually what I did in the first draft of Fever. It was set in the week where she was caught cooking for the second time. Or I ended up, the book in the end ended up being third person, but a very close third person, and was set over the course of about, I think, 12 or 15 years. And so those end up, even if you have the same elements, those are two very different books.
Right.
And that's a draft and draft and draft to find that. For those of you who don't know, Fever is about the real person who got nicknamed Typhoid Mary. She was a cook at the turn of the century in New York City named Mary Mallon, an Irish immigrant who was the first discovered healthy carrier of typhoid fever. So she was giving typhoid to these wealthy families that she was cooking for, even though she was never symptomatic herself. And so at the turn of the century, it was really hard for people to believe that you could be carrying this deadly disease in your body and giving it to people without being sick. The funny thing is, when I went on tour for Fever, people would ask me, they'd say, well, why didn't she listen to the doctors and stop cooking? And I would love to find all those people now and find out if they're wearing masks, if they're staying away from people. It's like, well, the doctor said you could be a potential carrier. Oh, no, you're at Costco picking out flowers. Oh.
Also, I think, even in writing historical fiction, didn't you still have to struggle to find the story you were telling? It's not like the outline of the story is okay. It's this person who existed and this thing happened to her and she impacted the world, but you still have to find, what are you really writing about?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And with her, there are like 2 points that are on record. She was in custody. Like, what happened to her in between? How did she end up from here to here? Like, that's, and also as you're saying, the center of the story, whether it be, love, self-reliance, forgiveness, whatever it may be, that's the real thing.
Right. Somebody asked, I think I missed it before, about the transgenerational theme of loneliness. Here they're writing about, thinking of Anne in Asking Anne Yes, and specifically whether Anne had overcome the trauma of hers, I guess, of her past and her, not just her mental illness, I guess, but her isolation in a sense.
I don't think of any of these people as having really overcome, and necessarily. I think they, particularly Anne, I think she learned how to live with it, and cohabitate with something that defined her, her childhood, and sort of set her on the trajectory she ended up on. Overcome, I think, would be too triumphant. I think of her as sort of a tragic figure. I also think of her as probably the strongest person in the book. And so maybe she overcame in that way. I'm not sure how to answer that.
Yeah, it's definitely not triumphant. It's very sad.
Yeah.
Very sad. So I think, was it something? I don't even remember. We had a correspondence recently, or I saw something you tweeted where you mentioned one of your favorite books was one of your favorite books, Caddie Woodlawn. And I actually thought on second reading of Ask Again Yes that Kate has some Caddie Woodlawn-esque attributes. She's kind of running around. She has to go fast, and she's getting into scrapes, and she's blunt and fierce. I love that. But so that's just an aside. But were there particular books that informed the writing of this book, or particular books that sort of you think made you into a writer? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to say. I think I was just talking about this to somebody, but I didn't grow up in a reading household. I've written about this. Sorry to bore anyone who's read I wrote an essay about this a year or two ago, but I just didn't. My parents didn't read. I hope they're not on this Zoom because I'll get a call when I'm done. But my mother, I remember she bought the encyclopedia. Somebody came to the door and sold us encyclopedias, which she spent a lot of money on. And then I said on the radio a couple years ago that we didn't have books growing up. And she was like, excuse me, did I not spend $500 on those stupid encyclopedias? But the point is, like, that's the level of like reading we did. And so but in a weird way, it ended up being a gift because I would go to the library. We also weren't allowed to watch TV. So we were allowed to read. We just had to like go procure our own books. And so I had no preconceptions as to what I should be reading or shouldn't. And I carried that, into college. And so when people would come in with these opinions that were sort of like baked in about, these iconic books. I remember discussing like The Bell Jar at a seminar at Barnard, and I had never heard of it before like 2 weeks prior when it was assigned. And I got the sense right away that there were like things you're supposed to think about it. Not only that book, but like every book. And I just didn't have that because I didn't know what you were supposed to think about it because I'd never heard of them.
I think that is a gift. I mean, I felt the after selling my book, the year before it came out and the year of was really the first time I started reading a lot of books before they were published because, they would get sent to me or I knew people who were writing books. And it was such a wonderful way to read because then I would see reviews come out and books that got raves I hadn't thought were so great and books that got panned I thought were great or not panned, but it just made me feel like I want to just not read reviews, like just come at it as a human being, as a reader, not knowing things. And you can't really undo all this stuff about certain authors. Like I've never read a Jonathan Franzen novel. I should, but it's like I know too much already. I don't know that I can.
Right. I know. And are you allowed to like it? I mean,
I don't know.
Yeah, I do love certain Jonathan Franzen novels, but I feel like everyone's like, shush, come on, don't say that. But anyway, that's a different conversation. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly books that I'm drawn to now that I think have absolutely nothing to do topically with what I write, but the way they, I think I'm a huge admirer of sentences, like really the nitty gritty, how things are put together, how images are presented, structure, things like that. And there are things when I see a writer move so gracefully between scene, I don't know, these are like worksmith things, I look for the oil in the machine, and those things are really influential. And then it has felt good when I have really fallen in love with someone that I realize is, a huge writer. And I'm like, oh, okay, I found this person all on my own. It feels, I'm consistently drawn to things about class, anything to do with work. And so I'll try to read about that sort of thing. I think money is so rarely discussed explicitly in literary fiction. They're like glancing references to like having a lot or not, but like what it actually means to be not sure how to pay a bill, things like that. I'll always read a writer who maybe gets into that sort of thing. And I mean, there are too many. William Trevor was a huge influence on my early career, still is. Louise Erdrich, big influence. And I find I identified so much with the way she wrote about the people she was writing about. And even though she was a lot of times setting her books on reservations and talking about the Native American community, I think she's the one who taught me that if you do something right, a human will identify with any other human experience, and tie it to their own. And so those are two biggies. A lot of Irish poets too. Seamus Heaney is big for me. Maeve McGuckian, a couple of others.
Somebody wants to know that when you were writing at Barnard or UVA or anywhere else, did any of the characters that ended up in Ask Again Yes come to life through earlier experimental works, short stories, novels shoved into desk drawers, pages tossed into wastebaskets?
Probably not that early. No, not. I mean, anything that was good out of those years, I just wrung every drop out of it and turned it into its own thing. So no, I don't like bake on things. I also do this weird thing a lot of people don't. Karen, I'm interested to hear what you do, but I'm not one of those people who keeps a file of like big cuts or rejected, drafts or old things that I'm going to rework. I just chuck them.
No, I mean, I'm not really organized enough to chuck them. Like they are here, but they're not here because I need to retrieve them. Like I just move them. You know, I work in Scrivener and I move things to trash, but then I forget to empty the trash, which is not a bad thing, because the other day I happened to look in the trash and I was like, what's that doing there? So I can pull it out. But no, I don't have a novel in a drawer. I mean, yeah, I use what's good I use, and the rest is
Yeah.
in a pile somewhere. So there's a very long question here. I'm curious about your perspective on Americanization and loss of cultural norms that anchor someone within a particular community. I read Kate's bluntness as her being more forthright like an American, whereas Frances was more reserved as an Irishman. Similarly, in The Walking People, that's your first novel, is that right?
Yeah.
James proudly states that he's from the Big Apple, but his family's Irish immigrant friends are quick to correct him, stating Ireland as his true home. I'm fascinated by how you straddle both identities, American and being of Irish parentage, in your writing.
That's funny. That's a great question.
Yeah, it's really-
Honestly, I'm not sure I know the answer. It's something that I've just been thinking about my entire life. I spent a lot of summers going back to Ireland, especially when my parents were alive. I have a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins there, and in Ireland, I couldn't possibly feel more American. You know, with like everything from what I was, especially in the 80s, like what I was wearing to the music I was listening to this, that, and the other. But in the US, I lived in this culture, in this community where everyone was sort of, and still is, this is not a criticism, but like fixated on being Irish, you know, like the kids in my town, there's probably some people from my town on this, in this meeting, but the kids still play very serious GAA Irish football. They have their own pitch. They compete in Ireland. Jerry Adams came and blessed the field. I think the president of Ireland was there, not the Taoiseach, but the president. And that's all good and fine. But I think I guess I'm just always wondering, what it's for. Less so now. I find it much sweeter now and much sort of harmless now. And as my kids are getting older, it's a comfort to see them do things that I saw, you know, when I was a kid and I was involved in. But at the same time, I don't know, the way my dad talks about America, he came here because he loved America. You know, he had to find work. But then it feels like the more generations you're out, the more, I don't know, people seem to get really fixated on proving how Irish they are when it's perfectly fine to be American too. You know, I don't know. I think it's just something I've just noticed my whole life because I've been confused and I have had both, you know, like some people I know, even in my own life, sort of code switch. They have a brogue when they're with Irish people. They don't when my mother even does this. And so like, if you're a writer and you're an observer, you know, my mother in Macy's sounds like she grew up on 73rd Street. You know, but if you put my mother in the Bronx then she sounds like she never left the bog. You know, it's an amazing thing to observe. But, you know, and I think just as a person who writes and is interested in the way people are, I don't know, I've just been interested in immigration and who you are, what makes you who you are, and then what about the kids?
It's also interesting how you can leave a place, be nostalgic about it, but then also not want to talk about it because there's a reason you leave. It's because of things were not so great.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing I've noticed, and that I sort of tried to make I tried to make that point through Frances, is a lot of Irish Americans, especially several generations out, I think picture Ireland as this like wonderful place, you know, a land of milk and honey and music and dancing. And it is those things truly in a lot of ways. I mean, like we've said our whole lives, like food just tastes better there, you know, like there's more of a sense of fun. The land is beautiful. And we always had a ball when we were there. But my parents, my dad in particular, left for a reason. You know, it was a brutal place. And especially in the 50s and 60s, if you were poor and if you lived in a place that was really remote. My dad was one of 11. His mother died about a year or two after that 11th child was born. You know, what do you do? I mean, like legitimately, they had a spoon that they shared in like a common pot of, you know, porridge in the schoolhouse. And my dad stopped going to school when he was in about 6th grade for good. So, it's hard to take sometimes, like if you're declining your own background in order to embrace this, I guess I don't know. I'm not being articulate, but part of me wants people to know what it actually was. And so that I think I see my dad being confused too. Why would you decline America?
Right.
For that? Ireland is different now. It was a third world country until like 1986. So it's a different Ireland now. It's more global. They're much smarter and more advanced than America is in so many ways, socially, environmentally. But I don't know. Riding that line, like I said before, it's not for me to answer. I think it's just for me to sort of document.
So do you know what you're writing about in your next book? Can you say, do you want to say?
I have a lot of pages, I'll tell you that. I don't know. I mean, it's set in a bar, and the bar is sort of it's failing.
Where is it? Is it in?
The bar is in Gillam.
Gillam?
Yeah, it is.
It's in Gillam. Okay, so you're gonna have a Gillam series.
Yeah, maybe that's an idea. I mean, I thought about naming it a different town. Everyone would be like, is this Gillam? And is it Pearl River again? So yeah, you don't see any of the people that were in the last novel, but it's the same vibe, sort of a working class sort of combination close to the city place. But in any case, the bar is not doing that well, and nor is the marriage at the center of the book. But I'm determined this time to have it be the whole thing take place in about a week.
Wow.
I've never done that before. All my books are like 50 years, or something terrible to keep control of. And so this is the challenge for me, is like structurally, how do you drive a novel through a week without bogging it down with a lot of flashback?
This is exactly what I'm struggling with, because my first novel took place in a summer, and now I've set myself up somehow trying to make this one 2 weeks. And I don't know why I'm doing this to myself, because I can't figure out the exact thing.
Summer is a nice short period.
No, summer was good. That was the first one. Now I've shortened it to a couple of weeks that I'm working on now.
Not too far off.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a lot. But it's the backstory problem. Someone is asking a light question. Can you tell us anything about the television series?
Oh, I wish. I don't know. I mean, COVID and everything else, Fever, the option's just been going on and on forever. Elizabeth Moss, the actress, is the person who optioned those rights. And she's been doing Handmaid's Tale and a bunch of other, I think Handmaid's Tale was supposed to be 1 season, and now it's like in season 4. And so I don't know. I honestly thought she would drop the option last time it expired. So options are good for usually 18 months or 2 years, and then you renew and renew and renew. Because it takes a long time to get all your ducks in a row with, you have to get a writer, you got to get producers, then you have to pitch it to studios. And so Fever is in development. I believe it's with BBC America. But I haven't heard a word in a long time, except that it's still it's not like in a dusty back closet somewhere.
Right. Did you want to have anything to do with the writing of either of these?
No.
As TV series? No. Because I know some writers do that. I wouldn't. I'd have no idea how.
No, I feel like it takes me so long to write a book. Ask Again, Yes, this came up a little bit. I just want to, it's time to move on. It may be, the funny thing is now I finished Fever in 2012, I guess it came out in 2013. Now I might go back, and I'd be interested in participating in that more than I was, that like exhaustion you feel when you're done with a book.
Like you've said what you want to say on that.
Yeah, I've been with these, it's like being in a room with the same people for 4 years, you want different people, but now, going back for a visit might not be the worst thing.
Back to another plague. Maybe that plague's better than our plague.
Yeah.
And what about Ask Again, Yes as a series? What's happening there?
I mean, that's just been in the works for about a year before COVID. I think they were working on a writer. This is a tricky one because it takes place over such a long time.
We need
but
a young Kate and an old Kate.
Right. But I haven't heard anything in a while. All I know is it's active and they're working, and this is a strange time because everything is shut down, in Hollywood.
I've heard now they're more into optioning books that don't require crowd scenes.
Yes, if you have set your novel in a prairie and nobody ever goes inside, it's more likely to be
Yeah,
made.
if Room hadn't been written yet, it would be the one to write
Right.
still now, right?
My friend, he does the lighting for a couple of, for, you know, different, this is his job. He's a location scout and he also does something with the lighting. But anyway, he was saying that like, if you are shooting a scene and it's one person just thinking, you know, like alone in a room from a distance, Meryl Streep is sitting at a table. There's actually like 15 people in the room. So
Right.
they can't shoot anything like that.
Right.
So it's just to create, you know, our TV is going to run out pretty soon, all our new content.
What will we do?
I know. I watch Alone, which is the show I love. So that's, I think that's good.
Yeah, I've watched some of those. My sister was watching that. For anyone who doesn't know, it's a the survival one where people are sent off into the wilderness and they have to survive. Yeah, and every time I take a walk with my sister up in Cape Cod, she's like, oh, that's a sharp rock. We could use that to stab a seal. She's always planning like how she would survive if she were alone.
That's funny. My son too, they would get along. He's like, I'll bring my gill net.
Right, exactly. Someone wants you to tell the Jimmy Fallon story.
Oh, well, there's not much of a story. I just got it one day, my publicist called and said, your book is a finalist for the Jimmy Fallon Tonight Show Summer Reads. And there are 5 finalists and there's like a voting period. And then the winner goes on the show. I thought this was like a thing that would never happen, you know, and you are asked all the time to promote these things on your social media, you know, and put it here and there, and so do they. But next thing I started like winning. And then I kind of wanted to win, and I got my whole town to vote and we all got together. And this is the great thing about where I'm from, you know, like if you're one of theirs, like they will all come together for you and help, and everybody did. And I was standing online at ShopRite one day during this like intense voting period, and someone said, oh, she said, girl, you're the girl who wrote the book. I said, yeah. And she said, why aren't you voting? I thought she was going to say, I like your book, but this was during a voting frenzy.
You should have been voting, right? Can you vote more than once?
Everyone can, yeah, you could vote more than once. So that once we figured that out, and the kids were voting like crazy, like around the clock. So I said this on the show that I told the kids, like, if you vote 100 times a day and your mother says, yep, he's been refreshing that page, I'll bring you to King Cone, you know, on the last night of voting, whether I win or lose. And so my younger son was in a basketball camp, and even at camp, they like gave a 10-minute break where you're not allowed electronics. They're like, all right, come on, let's vote for her, everybody continuously for 10 minutes. And it was awesome. You know, it was great. And so then I won by like a hair.
Someone else had their town on it.
I guess he lives in Australia. So the funny thing is he's also Irish. So I wonder if it's all of us just getting every person we know. There's so many of us. So then I went on the show and I was nervous, but it was the most wonderful experience. Like they were.
Did you get coached before going on the show, or did they just say, be yourself?
No, they sent me to what I call Smile School. I don't know what the actual name of what this is. It's like media coaching.
Like constantly?
Well, I apparently am told I don't smile almost at all, especially when I'm nervous. I have like a bad resting bitch face, I guess. And so it could have been real bad, you know, if they didn't. The woman was wonderful and she works with a lot of famous people. One thing she told me was like, you know, past 40, a smile really like hoists up your face, which is something that I've been.
It's more important to smile when you're older.
I think that was the implication. Yeah. I mean, she was great. This is just how I'm like receiving this, but she videoed me, like she was Jimmy and I would answer the questions, which is like, took me 2 rounds to just get past my own self-consciousness and cringing for myself. But when you watch yourself be horrible, you know, it's a real motivation.
Doesn't that make it worse?
No, I'm like, no, I have to fix this. This is a problem that's like on my lap next week. Like I can't be in front of 11 million people and be like that.
So were you practicing at home all week, like smiling all through dinner?
No, I mean, I tried to be smilier, but I still don't think I was that smiley. I think I was very nervous.
Did you
But
have
I
a glass of
now-
wine before you went on?
What's that?
Did you have a glass of wine before you went on?
I had one
Glass
glass
of
of wine. It was like filled to the brim. But I had a couple of friends in the back room and my husband, and there was like a, you know, a finite amount of wine in the room. And we, of course, we weren't going to ask for anything. John Travolta was in the next room and, you know, he can ask for whatever he wants, but I was like, we're just going to have this, you know, they left us crackers. We're not asking for anything. And I poured myself a glass of wine before I went on, a second glass, but I didn't have it. I just said, this better have this exact amount in it when I come off that stage, because if one of you drinks this wine while I'm up here, you know, it's death. So that's what I did. That was my strategy. And I think it was a good one. But I have noticed now, since going to Smile School, people on TV who can smile and talk, like they can,
Yeah, I
it's
never-
really a skill that you do not think about. Start noticing it. Like it's like those anchors and like people doing the, like, it's an amazing thing to smile and talk at the same time. I can't do it.
sounds exhausting.
It must be exhausting. It's not for me anyway. I did it once. I'm done. 4 minutes.
That was something I'm sure you did not expect when you're writing a book and you're sitting there with your
Okay.
chapters and meandering pages to think you're going to end up talking about it on Jimmy Fallon.
Yeah, it is funny. And then my parents, who have no idea what to make of any of this, it was hilarious. Like they were completely like flummoxed. Like they knew that I wrote books and I was like a writer, you know, but they're like, oh, this is real. You know, she's on the television, you know, or whatever. So it was fun.
That's
He was
good.
so nice and more handsome in real life, I think.
Really?
Yeah, he was a nice guy.
That's nice. Well, we're just about at 3:30, so I'm just going to ask if there are any other questions to send them in. Anything you want to talk about that I didn't ask you about that you're dying to share?
No, I'm good. It's been fun as usual. I like doing events related close to home. I feel like people know the area, so.
Yeah, definitely. So wait, I do have a question about Gillum. I mean, did you write it as if it was Pearl River? Like, are you describing streets and places, or did you kind of create a new Pearl River in your head? And now you're going to have that same, not Pearl River in your next book?
Yeah, it's not Pearl River. No,
Right.
because I would be too distracted by trying to make it accurate. So it's never, it's just the like general attitude, I think, and mix of types of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. No, I don't think I'll ever write about well, in Fever, it was New York City, but no, I think it's the burden is too big. And also it's like pointless to the real meat of the book.
Yeah, although I did it in Last Book Party in Truro, but it was kind of easy because there's nothing in Truro. It's so small. It's really, you know, a few roads and not much is there. And so it was more sort of like describing the landscape, and I know it so well, but I don't think I could do it on any bigger town than that.
Yeah, and I'm sure my experience of Pearl River is really different than someone else's. And so I wouldn't want to like summarize a whole place based on my narrow existence.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, I think
We good?
saying thank you now. So I guess we're good. Giovanna, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to thank both of you for joining us, for agreeing to do this program. And we were hoping to do this in April, so I'm glad that we were able to reschedule to now. And I know you're both working on new books, so keep us posted. And we'd love to have you back when when maybe the pandemic is settled down and we can actually do something face-to-face in person.
Oh, please let that happen. That sounds great.
Yeah, that would be nice. When we postponed this, it was like, oh, that'll be great. We're postponing, but then at least we can do it in person. So
Yes, definitely.
fortunately, I'm writing my next novel very slowly, so I'm pretty confident the pandemic will be behind us. But
that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing.
yeah,
Get on a plane again.
yeah.
Thank you again. And I think our director
Yeah,
had
thank
to
you.
sign off, but this was wonderful. And you could see in the comments how everyone enjoyed hearing both of you talk.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. You
And
wonder if people are getting tired of Zoom events, but it's nice
I
that so many people joined.
And thank you, Karen, again for doing this.
It's a pleasure, and I really liked reading the book again.